So today, folks, we've got Associate Professor Kate Crowley speaking to me about public policy and specifically looking at the ways in which we can analyse public policy. Thank you so much for your time, Kate.
Yeah, no worries.
We're just going to run through a few questions. So first of all, I thought I'd just get you to describe your current role in terms of how you're working with public policy and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I've always seen myself as an applied analyst. That's what I like to be. So I try to make the theory work in practice to improve policy. Originally with environmental policy, but increasingly with all sorts of policy, social policy, etc. And so like the current book that I'm working on policy theory is looking at reconsidering basic sets of policy concepts that we might have learnt about in theory. So for example, I'm writing a chapter on institutions, but it's reconsidering that in terms of its utility now as an evolved concept for solving complex problems. So very much trying to push the theory through to problem solving. And I have to say that a lot of my colleagues say that this can't be done. And I just think, well, why are they bothering to study policy? Because that's what I see. Applied policy to me is that's the whole point.
That's the whole point.
Problem solving.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, so I work with practitioners as well to improve policy, and I've been advised government on environmental policy and climate. And that's everything from broad contextual stuff, you've got to think differently, right down to really narrow stuff like, here's a better process.
Yep, okay.
So that's policy. It's from the big to the narrow.
Okay, fantastic. Awesome. So tell us a little bit about how policy making happens in Australia.
So a bit like sculpting fog.
I like that one.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of processes. And I think, again, this is me speaking, not all policy theorists.
Yeah, that's
but
okay.
There's obviously at the micro level there's process, but then at the big level there's the context. And I don't think you can divorce them. So in my mind, I always think about, no matter where I am in terms of looking at policy, there'll be the micro level, so processes and whatever happens there. But then as you move sort of more broadly, there'll be politics, and that will have a great determining influence on the process. And then you move up higher and you think, well, what's the context? What are the institutions? And then beyond that, institutions are the product of human thought. So what are the ideologies, and are they constraining change, for example? And then just more broadly, what are values? So policy making should happen, we learn from the textbooks at the process end.
Right.
But we all know that the sort of, what are the values, what are the politics, what's the institutions, what's the constraints and opportunities. So I try to keep my big hat on, and that can be really frustrating.
I bet.
So when you want to narrow down into one aspect of that, you can, but just be aware of the context. So that doesn't really answer the question about actually how it happens, but to say that sometimes it's quite very settled and ordinary and orderly within a government agency, but at other times it's tellingly disorderly and just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And for some reason never works. Child protection.
Yeah,
classic.
Right.
So how long is a piece of string sort of answer to that question.
Okay, great. No, that's not unexpected. So what about policy analysis? Tell us about what that is.
Well, again, this is something that happens at all sorts of different levels.
Yep.
So really, if you want to know in a nutshell, it's sort of like the reflection on the usefulness or the utility of policy. It might be analysis and advice just being undertaken internally. So you might be analysing something to give advice.
Okay.
And it that used to be solely an internal government activity, but what's increasingly happened post the 60s with the democratising influences post the 60s is that the advisory community has grown from just the advisor to government to all sorts of within government, external, crossing the boundaries of both wholly external, international. The advisory community's really grown. So policy analysis is undertaken at all levels within those. Yeah, so that I've just finished writing a chapter on that, and that's just fascinating because it's sort of both liberating in that analysis now is drawn from what I think of when I think of it. I think there's hard sources, so there's the evidence, the facts, the experts, and they may or may not reside within government. They might be within an institute external or in a university or somewhere else, or they might be that expert person within government.
Okay, right.
A lot of that expertise has been stripped away because of neoliberalism. And right through to policy analysis as a soft activity, and that just might be a felt preference from the community.
Okay, right.
I am analysing environmental policy by standing up and saying that this area shouldn't be logged. So it's increasingly become legitimate that advocacy is a form of policy analysis.
Okay. How interesting.
Yeah, and so therefore groups like that will then write submissions. Well, in a sense, they're policy analysis.
Right, okay, I see.
So, but then if we're talking about within government, all agencies will have their own processes and purposes for doing that. I always think of analysis as a means of improving policy. Getting new ideas up, but it also serves all sorts of other reasons, as I'll say a bit later.
Yep, okay, great. So what are the different reasons then that governments analyse policy? Could you share a bit more about that?
Well, again, all agencies will have standard techniques, and I was thinking about this, thinking the method will be specific to the issue at hand.
Okay, yep.
It might be that that they will be analysing policy internally to roll out a new program.
Okay, yeah.
And that can backfire if it's not the appropriate level of government that's doing it and it's not appropriately consultative or there's other sorts of issues.
Yep.
Then we get our classic policy failures because of the lack of analysis.
Yep.
In the policy process, whichever process it is, there'll usually be a formulation process. And so if there's not upfront analysis done, the wrong model of problem solving might be adopted, and then you might get failure. And I think they're the classic case that students will have heard about in the literature or just in general is Kevin Rudd's pink bats. Housing insulation scheme. And so how else do governments analyse policy? It's again, I probably maybe see things too broadly, but I can see that they might do it from all levels, from the macro to the micro again.
Right.
They may do it in combination with an authority. So I used to chair the Climate Change Statutory Authority for the state government in Tasmania. And so we were very much being used as a melting pot for formulating advice on a whole range of issues. I think I counted up by the end of my 3-year term, over 300 pieces of advice.
Okay.
The policy that was released by that government had 8 points in it from the 350 pieces of advice. So they used us to distill down what they thought were the key things they needed to do.
Right.
Governments may also think that something's beyond them, so they want to review the tax regime in the country. So they got Ken Henry to do a report. Again, he had over 300 recommendations, and they adopted a couple.
Oh, wow.
And that's
amazing.
Yeah, and so the mining tax came out of that. The carbon tax was reinforced as the cheapest way of acting on climate change. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there, and so they're still talking about tax reform at the moment. You'll hear the Turnbull government talking about it at the moment, and they're picking off little politicised bits of it. They could go back to the Henry tax review and think about doing a proper root and branch sort of use that policy analysis that's already been done.
Right.
But for political reasons, they're not.
Oh, okay.
So what they sometimes do, like in terms of answering the question, how do they analyse policy? There they got in an expert. They got the over 300 recommendations.
Yep.
They cherry-picked out what they want. They're doing politicised stuff years down the track. They could then, and this is something governments often do, re-engage an expert who they're more politically comfortable with to write a new Henry report that's more a Conservative government would be happier with.
Yeah, right.
So it's there's no one answer to this stuff.
No, but that's I think you've really showed the nuances in that, in terms of how complicated it can actually be, and the different influences coming from all sides of that process.
Yeah. So the other really good example is a hybrid form of analysis. And so what came to mind for some reason was the Murray-Darling Basin Authority.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's really complicated, and there are quite a few models in the policy problem community of hybrid stuff. So this is an intergovernmental problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem. It's a transboundary environmental problem.
Okay.
So they set up an authority to deal with it, which has got the ministers for environment sitting around the table for each of the states and federally, and also bureaucrats and the statutory authority, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and they may or may not get a scientific report, so that analysis might be contracted out, or their authority might have the expertise to do it. They then pull together a plan. So on the basis of all the expertise, they do brilliant work. It's never implemented.
Oh, wow.
Because it goes back to round table with all the ministers and all the states, and then they argue about it. If they do finally adopt it, so they did adopt the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, I think during the Gillard government.
Okay, yeah.
And part of that, of course, is that the problem is there's not enough water running through.
Yeah, right.
So at least can we get some water running through?
Yeah.
So at a minimum, let's do that. Well, that plan was burnt in the streets and stomped on, and effigies of ministers were burnt.
Wow.
So that went back to square one. So all that wonderful work that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority oversees in terms of policy analysis just got totally trashed by the politics.
Wow.
And of course, 40% of our produce, agricultural produce in Australia, comes from the Murray-Darling Basin, and it's drying up.
Wow.
So it's a major problem.
Yeah.
So that's a fascinating one. I think that's a fascinating one. The other last example I was thinking of, wholly external policy analysis. So, government does its own policy analysis, but it's increasingly had that expertise stripped out because of neoliberal reforms, downsizing. So a lot of people within government that may have actually done policy analysis themselves now, they're more, and this is not wholly true, so there'll be some places where it's still done.
Yeah.
But people in those jobs now might find themselves more as brokers.
Okay.
So we need this knowledge. How do we get it?
Yep.
So we'll broker a bit from here and there and somewhere else. And at the moment, governments are talking about energy policy and how to bring the cost of... There's two things: how to bring the cost down of energy, because there's been an overinvestment in technology that's basically dated. And then how do we bring on renewable, because that's going to be cheaper. So this is really hard, because the subsidies are all in the old industries and they don't want to strip the subsidies off and give them to the new industries.
Okay, right.
So an external agency does some analysis, the Grattan Institute, this week or last week, so I'm talking about March 2018, did a really great report, which was covered by all the papers, on how states can bring down the cost of energy. So that bit of, and the Grattan Institute does brilliant analysis, and it's all independent.
Yeah.
So governments will often draw that down and look at it and either respond favourably or unfavourably, use it or not use it. So that just shows you the role of an external institute.
Right. Okay.
So that's heaps.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I have to say, the upside for people studying policy is this field has exploded.
Yeah, right.
And my international students said that when they came over, they thought they were studying policy to get a good job in government. But at the end of the course, they realised government or non-government. So there's all sorts of opportunities now.
Yeah, there you go. How interesting. That was fantastic. Thank you. So I think we've just got one question left, which is, how are policy documents rather than processes analysed? Can you tell us about that? Yeah, so
I think people watching or listening will be able to put their hands up and say, well, I can tell you how that happens where I work.
Yes, yeah,
okay. And that's a valuable contribution, and everyone will have something different to say, even if they're from within the same agency. I just dotted down a few things that I could think of offhand. So maybe against an original brief.
Okay,
so something might happen, so let's check it against the original brief.
Okay.
Now, there are reasons for not doing that also, because people within an agency may know they've departed from the brief and they don't want to embarrass the minister by pointing that out.
Okay, right.
Because the minister's had a change of heart. So it may or may not happen. But there might also be criteria for a review that's determined. So when I was chairing the Climate Change Council, we decided to instigate a review of the carbon value of retained forests.
Okay, yeah.
And so then you would analyse what came in against the review criterion, and so that's another way of doing it.
Okay, yeah.
You might also analyse a document that, well, this is what we had, now we're at our 6-monthly review, but circumstances have changed. We either have opportunities have opened up or constraints. So we will possibly analyse against what we intended to do, but bearing in mind these new circumstances.
Okay, yeah.
Because if we want to go forward, then we have to be realistic. So it might be done like that.
Okay.
It may be very official reporting criteria. You might be reporting to Parliament.
Yeah, I see. Yep.
Yeah, you might have to report against criteria. I know that, for example, some agencies have very, very, not all agencies, in fact, quite not a lot, but some agencies have excellent annual plans with criteria that they want to try and measure themselves against.
Okay, yep.
And so their annual plans are really important, and they try to report against what they intended to do and then publish that. The state of Minnesota did this, and they called it, I think it was results-based government or something.
Okay, yeah.
They wanted that every agency, when a member of the public clicked on the internet and went to an agency, they wanted them to see the name of the agency and what we've achieved against our criteria as the opening page.
Okay, right.
So that was quite interesting.
Yeah, how fascinating.
Hard. It can be hard to do. You can have goals and you just can't meet them.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I also think documents may be analysed against their applicability, which might change, and against need, which might change. You might have a natural disaster, so what you previously proposed is now ridiculous.
Yeah, right.
And you have to, or you might have had a pandemic outbreak or some sort of social outbreak or terrorism incidents, which can change things. So crisis and chaos and incidences can massively disrupt whole policy processes for agencies.
That's understandable.
And I also said how, but also when. We learn about policy process in theory, but really you could do policy analysis at any of the stages.
Yeah, anytime.
Any of the stages.
Yeah.
And it might be a good thing to do. Having missed it early on, it might be a good thing to still do. I used to think that incremental change of policy was very sloppy, and now I think it's very necessary.
Right.
Because sometimes that's the best you can do.
Yeah.
So stop, do some analysis, rejig, head in a better, more efficacious direction. Yeah, so, but again, I think, like all of these questions you've asked me will be good questions to then turn around and ask the students from their perspective, and particularly if they're in different work areas, and then construct the knowledge up out of that, I think is really useful.
Fantastic. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. That was really helpful.
Oh, good. It is like sculpting fog.
Yeah.
And I have to say, two things that drive me is I love it because it's messy, and I find that fascinating. And there's so many problems that we need to solve in society. So policy is a bit of an opening door for how to do that.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you.